Welcoming from De Bali in Amsterdam on Europe Day, everyone. We are here with esteemed guests and Maria Exner joining us from Berlin. And still before I introduce everyone, I'm Reka Papp from Eurozine, editor-in-chief of Eurozine, and I'm very happy to be talking on this celebration of the Schuman Declaration on this day in 1950, when we're supposed to celebrate European unity and peace. And if somebody forgot in the meantime how peculiar unity and peace in Europe was, this year we have a very stark reminder. Let's get to the point. Today's conversation is specifically about a joint European public sphere, a venture that is pretty much incomplete at this point, incomplete at best. We are going to talk about why, but we are also mainly going to talk about how it could come to light and what the European Cultural Foundation and its partners are doing to make it happen, make it more inclusive and fair for a general European public to participate and be a part of. So with me, and I'm going to start with the remote partner, are Maria Exner from Berlin. She is the founding director of Publix and a journalist herself. Welcome. And everybody else here present around this table are Alexander Baratsits, chairman of the Cultural Broadcasting Archive based in Austria, who is going to tell us about the European Backbone Project, I believe. André Wilkens, director of the European Cultural Foundation, and a big believer in a European space project, and a professional optimist. So I'm relying on you for a hopeful note at this point. Babah Tarawally, a columnist for the Dutch daily the Trouw. Do correct me if I mispronounce it. I'm sorry for this.
Well said.
Indeed, and working with the Reframing Migrants program. He's going to tell us about how such a European public sphere can be truly inclusive, and not just geographically, but all the way through. Giancarlo Fiorella is an investigator and a trainer for Bellingcat, also based now in Amsterdam, who is going to tell us, among others, about their Ukraine Accountability Archive. So very welcome. We'll cut to the chase. My first question, which first goes to Maria, is without debating the fact that the European public sphere at this point is insufficient, at least, what is one tangible thing that you can propose that you think in the current situation, without ifs and buts and future prerequisites, we could start doing right now to build such a European public sphere that truly serves everyone included?
Thank you, Reka, and thank you for the good question. So I think from my perspective as a journalist and media professional, I think what we can do right now is strengthening the ties between European journalists and media makers across the continent, and with a specific focus on Eastern Europe, because I think we have all learned that their problems are our problems at the moment, and we need to better understand and also address them. And I think what we are missing is kind of networking opportunities, infrastructure that supports this kind of networks to enable media makers to work together. And this is not a kind of an aim in itself, but I think it should serve that the European public has a better understanding of shared problems in different European countries, but also solutions that we can transfer from one country to another, and that we can establish a shared sense of what are our common challenges for the future that we all share across Europe. Because at the moment, I think each and every country has still in the citizenship and understanding of, these are our specific German problems, and there are specific different Dutch problems and specific different Ukrainian problems. And I think to move across that, I think networking and collaboration is going to be key, and it's possible, I think, to establish such a network.
Thank you. I think André has made the point on a few occasions that for a shared European sentiment, we would probably also need a shared European public holiday, which you're suggesting should be the 9th of May. Also because a paid day off of work is probably a good way to foster togetherness. But beyond that, André, what would be your starting proposal or your take, how to go about this?
Yes, if it would be already a proper holiday, Europe Day, then we would, of course, be working on a holiday. But I will commit here publicly that I will always work, if necessary, on Europe Day, even if it is a public holiday. Anyway, coming to the public space, I think my proposal is to move up the debate and the issue of the European public space from something which may be considered by many as something as nice to have to essential. At the moment, when you talk about the European public space, people say in Sunday speeches, "Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, please go about it and do something about it." But that's not enough. We saw this already with Brexit, and we saw it with a whole Trump campaign and then the Trump years, how the public space was used for political goals quite successfully from the wrong side, at least from my perspective. And we see it now in Ukraine and in Russia, how media, how the digital public space is used for the wrong purposes. And we in Europe, I think we have been captured by this idea that somehow the market will fix it. We are not intervening properly, and my proposal would be to move this up in the political agenda and make it a priority, and also provide sufficient funding for it. And my example always is, maybe it's not a perfect example, but it is an example. We created Airbus, the Europeans, because they didn't want to be dependent and on other air companies or airplane producers. So we did it once. Why can't we do it again? Why do we not invest properly and in the same way as we have built Airbus as a European cooperative venture and build digital infrastructure which is fair, which is inclusive, which has the highest standard of data protection, the best standards in the world, and be even more creative than what we have around now, which is all privatized, I have to say, and keep it, in my view, also free of advertising. So I think this is a kind of a moonshot project, so let's go for it.
Okay, I'm all for pushing the European Union to actually make good on its promises, which would be lovely to see. I'm also happy to hear, as an Eastern European, from Maria that she would propose also focusing on the nation states which seem to hold a little bit less of importance in shared public spaces or only popular as negative examples. And just a short reminder that the current war that properly and rightfully horrifies all of us started 8 years ago, and Ukrainians, journalists and otherwise have been trying to remind everyone throughout Europe and beyond that this war is ongoing, that this is serious, this is not something that we can just acknowledge as sort of a done deal, that an annexation, the annexation of major territories or any territories between sovereign nation states is supposed to be taken seriously, but somehow, although the current administration in Ukraine is ridiculously professional, like really surprisingly professional and skilled in using publicity, much more so than any administration throughout the region ever before, it seems that this is a very hard job to get these points across. Babah, you have a pretty big track record in making people understand things that are very far from their original perspective, that they are not naturally predisposed to be interested in, maybe. How would you go about this? How would you make the general European public interested in each other?
Very good question. I think when we think about Europe, sometimes we only think about one homogeneous type of people, white people. And we should be aware that Europe is very diverse. Just take Amsterdam, where we are now. We have 180 nationalities in Amsterdam. We are very diverse, but the question is whether we are inclusive. And the inclusion is, for me, very important, because how can we make countries inclusive when thinking about policies, thinking about how to go further, that you don't only think about your own needs, but you think about the broader needs of other people who are not seen. They are looked at, but they are not seen. So for me, when looking at this public space, in Holland, for example, I own the space. I'm part of this space. So the question is whether people from citizens from other European countries like Poland, Hungary, or other countries who are more perhaps not into the whole racism and discrimination topics, perhaps, how do they perceive me? Am I part of the whole European context? So my identity, where does that stand? So in talking about space, how we go about the space, we should be aware and we should recognize that we are many. And how should we, in our manyness, how can we come together as one people? And it is a big task. And that is the reason why, for me, I'm propagating that we should have a sort of Associated Press, something like that, or Reuters, that will focus on that migrant news, about migration, about ethnicity, about other identities who are not perhaps fully European in the eyes of the original Europeans, but to be seen also as inclusive. And how should we go about that? That is, for me, a big task. So if we can have a type of focus on that to make sure that all journalists in all European countries, they have a place where they can get those news and get aware of it so that they can make their citizens understand that things are happening in France, in Holland, in Germany, and which have to also do with them, but perhaps not directly now, but it's something that will come to them at a certain time. So we need to be very much aware. Education is very important. And so I will leave it now for at this point and see if we can, how we can go further.
You propose an intellectual process or an intellectual approach of making the point. What Alex proposes is building the infrastructure for this work, right? Alex, please tell us about the European backbone.
The European Cultural Backbone is an initiative also from the Cultural Broadcasting Archive, and maybe taking up the point, it's a podcasting platform which has 130,000 broadcasts in the meantime in 50 different languages, and the whole diversity is represented there. A lot of migrants group, for example, and ecologists, activists, and the initiative of the European Cultural Backbone is then to build a network with other such civil society platforms, because we think on the one hand, for this European digital sphere, it's not necessary to build something new from scratch, but to build a network of existing infrastructures which are now somehow isolated, and we're gonna have to network them then also to make network effects possible. So the way is to exchange metadata and then to be able to have common search engines running, to use together language tools to transport the information into other languages, and build recommenders so that we can share audiences. And this project, which is thankfully financed by the European Cultural Foundation, will be some sort of prototype how this could work, and could also face some sort of alternative to the big tech platforms, in a way that we do not build a central platform, but it is a distributed approach. So every node in this network can then decide which information will be furthered or not. So you have some sort of moderation effect built in this architecture that is similar to the system at Wikipedia, which is also able, without the big tech money, to handle information and handle disinformation by this way of community moderation. And this is a similar approach we want to pursue. And this prototype, we think, is not limited to civil society initiatives. So we are open, we want to work with open standards and can also connect with public service media, for example. And I think this would be then the approach to have a network, a European network that is sovereign from the technical infrastructure, but also content-wise, and it also shows the diversity we have.
Thanks. On that note, not building everything new or something new entirely from scratch, but building on or using existing tools, I think this very much ties in with Bellingcat, which has been pretty much spearheading a full technological change in journalism and generally work with publicity altogether. Giancarlo, please tell us about how you think about widening this European public sphere, and genuinely Bellingcat is widening the notion of journalism altogether.
Yeah, that's precisely the point that I want to get to, that if people know about Bellingcat, they probably know it from these big investigations that we conducted into, for example, exposing Russian spies that are operating in Europe. But a big part of the work that we do is giving those same tools, those same techniques, that same knowledge that we apply in our investigations to participants in workshops, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And so, when I look at the sign up there and I'm looking at the words public space, I'm thinking of the digital space, right? I mean, the digital space is increasingly, if it isn't now not all encompassing already, the place where people get together to talk about issues, right, from all over the world. And so in these classes that we give, we teach people, not just journalists, but I would say primarily non-journalists, how to use the same kinds of tools and techniques that Bellingcat uses in its investigations. And so the idea there is that we want to give people, wherever they live, the ability to hold power to account in their local community. So you don't have to be a journalist at a big, huge organization to conduct research, to bring to light something that's happening in your hometown. The idea is that anybody can do this with the right training. And so, as I heard you talk about your initiatives, I heard a lot of synergy with what I think is one of our missions here at Bellingcat, which is, again, to disseminate this knowledge so that it's not just journalists who are able to engage in this kind of important research and, again, bring corruption and wrongdoing to light, but rather anybody who has the training.
And you do rely on the input of people who will probably not stay on this career path or even pursue it at any point. Also with the new initiative regarding the war in Ukraine. Will you tell us about the Ukraine Accountability Archive, please?
Sure, yeah. So the Ukraine Accountability Archive is a project that we began in February, and the purpose of the project is to identify and to verify and to archive visual evidence of what could be war crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. So one of the things that happens to things like pictures and videos from conflict zones that are shared on big social media platforms is that they get deleted. Either the platform will delete it because it violates the content moderation rules, or the users who share these images will delete them themselves. And so what we're doing here is that we're trying to capture as much of this potential evidence as possible, archive it, verify it, through the very rigorous methodology that we employ in our investigations, and make sure that that data, that evidence isn't lost, so that if in some future, maybe in, 10, 15, 20 years, there is something like a prosecution at the International Criminal Court against named perpetrators of war crimes in Ukraine, then that evidence will exist. To your question, that project is taking part in large part thanks to the input of members of what we call the Global Authentication Project, which is a network of individuals who I'm sure most of them, if not all of them, not one of them is a journalist, but they've received training from Bellingcat on how to archive digital information, how to verify it. And so right now we have a group of I believe it's about 25 or 30 people from all walks of life, different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds. They live in different countries, they have different work experiences, but they're coming together here to contribute to what I think is a really important project. So the Ukraine Accountability Project as it's being shaped by these volunteers, I think is a really great example of the kind of thing that we want to see at scale. All across Europe and eventually the world, people from, again, all walks of life coming together, dedicating, whatever free time they have to contribute to something that might have really important implications in some future.
Thanks. I'd pose the next question to Maria because journalism, traditionally, at least in the past, say, few decades, has been trying to sort of define its professional boundaries. And of course, digitization and the, let's say, democratization or accessibility of getting something public or making something public has changed and shifted this much. And in the current InfoWars, there has been a lot of talk about how journalism is supposed to be a distinct profession that is not necessarily mixed up with any random photograph taken on the street. So in your view, Maria, you're very much focused on individual connections, professional connections that could foster a better understanding. How do you see such a project can be integrated, something that relies so heavily on volunteer work, on obviously rigorous, but not necessarily professional investigations, for instance? How do you see that fitting in?
I think I have a two-level answer to your question, which I think is a super relevant question. So I think, as you said, journalism has moved, and maybe not all people who work as professional journalists have, kind of see it that way, from being a profession to being a method. I think that's also what Bellingcat shows us and shows through their training. So, and I think we are at the moment in time where the journalistic method as a method to work with information and to verify information and to also contribute something to the public discussion in a certain country or across our continent should be disseminated much more widely into the public. And I think it needs institutions such as Bellingcat, but also all newsrooms should get better at kind of facilitating the public and other people with their method, and being maybe not more than the kind of people who carry these methods and professionalize them and transform them and bring them into the future. I think this is one role. And then the other thing, I think, to what you said, is that at the moment, newsrooms and journalistic institutions are not very good at being, kind of open to this kind of transcendent work with the wider public's view, and I think they need help. I think they need help in kind of training this competence that they don't yet have, and I think they also need good reasons why they do that, and that comes back to what André said earlier. In a world where journalism and media making has a very strong, kind of a business model relying on private advertising money, I think it's always a hard question. Why should professional newsrooms do that? And I think much of what the problems that have been addressed in the discussion are good reasons why they should do it. But I think there's some parts missing in the discussion on what could be real motivations and what do we need to change in order to bring kind of a new understanding and a new role for journalists in this regard about. I think it's not so, it's not done with saying journalism has changed. The method is more important than the actual, kind of what we publish at any given time. And that's how the newsrooms have to change, because I think that, that doesn't fit with the current financial model.
Yeah, on the one hand, source critique altogether, just like a very sort of dumbed down version of, or dumbed down sort of summary of the method, is very much being argued as something that needs to be the meta-narrative of all education at this point, because it's not the years from history, like the actual numbers that we need to remember. It's the handling of the sources that we need to remember, and that's going to be extremely useful against misinformation and disinformation, and in times of just content flooding the sphere, right? But on the other hand, I think it also has to deal with this kind of more intellectual process that Babah is proposing, to be inclusive from the start up and address the preconceived notions that many of us don't even like to talk about. Well, I like to talk about racism because I like to shock people with very obvious things. It's a very cheap method. But other than that, I think when we talk about the infrastructure that Alexander has mentioned, how do you see inclusion coded into, not necessarily, the sort of IT infrastructure, IT background, but maybe you also have a few notes on that. But what would be the first thing you make sure, or the first thing you say that this would ensure inclusion even beyond languages, for instance? Inclusion among languages within Europe is a crucial thing, obviously. This is not the US, where you can designate a majority language with all its problems and exceptions. But well beyond language differences, what would be your take, or what would you start with?
I think when I heard Alexandra talking about the infrastructure, I was very happy about it, because it's a good starting point to have infrastructure. But then the next stage is to have the representation. When people see themselves, they get that feeling of representation. And not only making the whole boardroom all white, you have to think about diversity, inclusion, get people on board. And also referring to what Maria just said about media being dependent on advertisers. That is also a way wherein diversity and inclusion are not skipped, because it's about business, it's about making money, and they don't care mostly about what minorities, their problems are. So perhaps it's also an advice to see if government, for example, let me just, I came back from Sierra Leone, where I was born 2 days ago, and there the journalist had got a motion to the government, putting a motion to the government to put 3% of the GDP for media houses, which is very unique. And so there was a discussion about it. Should media houses accept government giving them 3%? Is their dependency on government then becomes, will they be neutral? So that was the question involved. And the government said, no, we give them money, the 3% we can give it to them, but they are free to make any type of news they want to do, so that they are not depending on advertisers, depending on oligarchs who control the news. It's a small way of making change. I think they are on the right track. So this is also something which I'm thinking about, because most journalists only go behind advertisers, going behind the news, and not looking at what other minorities. And if you look in Holland, for example, I live in Utrecht. If you go to my neighborhood where I live, all the migrants have almost a satellite on their houses. Why do they have satellite on their houses? Because they are not being given the right information, the information they need from Europe. They don't get it. So they get satellites that goes to their own countries where they came from, their original places. So they think, I'm not part of this space. So how to make sure that they are part of this space? How to make sure that the content we give, they feel also represented? So that is, for me, one of the biggest questions I'm asking, and one of the things I would like to see happening, that if we have content, if you have the infrastructure done and you have content, that content, even though some other countries in Europe don't feel that they are part of that news, but they should understand that that news will one day come to them. So we are all in this together.
So you are arguing for a strong editorial approach here, to be cautious about not just the volume and the availability of content, but also how this is curated and how this is provided to people, right? I like to make this point in every occasion I get, and as a moderator I shouldn't, but I'll abuse this occasion to say that for some reason many major institutions hate to finance human labor. Paying wages is frightful and horrific, for instance, in most EU institutions, for some understandable reason. And in cultural work and in media, that's just just not something we can afford. Whatever kind of infrastructure you build, there's going to be an extreme amount of human labor that needs to back this up. Otherwise, there's no algorithm to really substitute that. And we've learned this the hard way. However, dedicating percentages of GDP is right up your alley, André, because you have been, and the ECF have been campaigning to dedicate at least 2% of each individual nation states or member states' recovery budgets to culture. How is this project going, and what's the next step there that we can make this a reality?
Okay, and I try to bring it around to the European public space in the end. No, but it's maybe a good example because you remember, of course, we're in a different age, but there was something like Corona until recently. Actually, we were quite occupied by this.
I kind of remember.
Do you remember?
But not much.
Yeah. So now, of course, we are forgetting, and
and
it's all totally gone away, at least until the autumn. But so we had the Corona hit in 2020. And then after some muddling around, Europe got its act together and created a recovery fund, actually quite a big one, 750 billion, and financed by kind of Eurobonds. They couldn't call them Eurobonds, but in principle, they created Eurobonds. So good idea. But then what we discovered was that the money was meant to go in all sorts of interesting infrastructure, possibly also digital, but there was no word of culture. While the cultural infrastructure had actually suffered tremendously, because I mean even theaters and stuff you couldn't work, but no word of culture. So we said, we launch a campaign for a culture deal for Europe to simply say, let's take an example of the original New Deal, the New Deal from Roosevelt. In the US, they had a cultural component called Federal One, which was investment in culture connected to the New Deal. And we thought, they have done it, good idea, let's do the same thing. And we said, at least 2%, it's not enough, because roughly 7% of the workforce is employed in culture and creative industries, so ideally it would have been 7%, but we said, okay, let's start with 2%, but 2% is still 15 billion investment in culture from zero. And last calculations, because many countries committed, unfortunately, the Netherlands are a little bit behind, but many countries committed, for example, Italy 4%, France 2%, and most countries in the end. And now, counting these commitments up, we're at around 10 billion, which is good, starting at zero. But
let me add a quick follow-up there. Do you think that such a dedicated funding specifically for media work on the problem that Babah has brought up, do you think that can still preserve the independence of media, or does that necessarily interfere with the journalists' work?
Okay.
What's your experience in culture, for instance?
It's a different question. I mean, the culture deal, anyway, for me, that is an example to move up something into the agenda which hasn't been there before. And it is possible. You just have to get your message heard, and it can happen. Moving back to the public space, I think we have a lot of experience with public broadcasters, good and bad. Look at Hungary, and you see a bad example. Look at Italy during the Berlusconi years, bad example. Look at Germany, Austria, to a certain extent also the BBC in the UK. There are some good examples. They need to be modernized, but I think in terms of like a free media funded by the public sector, by taxpayers, I think is a model which is good in principle. If there is a clear division between who gives the money and what journalists can do. And I think if it's done well, then it is a good model, and it's certainly preferred to simply relying on the private and the advertising sector to provide the funding for media, which is a very suboptimal model.
If I can just add to that, because it's a very good point you've raised. And if I see the public media, if you look at it keenly, you will see, for example, you mentioned BBC. BBC has, for years, since I was a kid, they have what they call Focus on Africa. It's a program which is widely heard in the African continent. They've continued to do that consciously. And that has created a type of African culture in the European scene. That many Europeans who listen to BBC, they know what is happening in the African continent. They know what is going on there. So that awareness is so important for people to know, to get aware of that we are perhaps in different continents, but we are all one. And that feeling should be very strong. And I think that is one of the things I propagate when we talk about media also, to make those media houses also diverse and also inclusive in terms of how we relate to news.
Thanks. Giancarlo, if there were such a major public funding scheme, there are in places, and of course, Bellingcat also is funded through certain grants projects, etc. But if there were major dedications, for instance, on nation states and the EU side, would Bellingcat be comfortable with working from those, or would that pose problems for you?
So our position has been that we would like to not be reliant on government funds to conduct our work. So in the past, I believe there are certain projects that were funded through the EU, and those are all publicly disclosed in our annual accounts, which are on our website. But we've always been hesitant, and we've wanted to move away from that as much as possible, to the point that our revenue streams now are diverse. Because we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket and then one day have to, come asking for money from, for example, a government. And so the model that we have now has been working for us since we started. We earn income through the trainings that we provide that I was talking about earlier. Also, we have individual donors. So we have, a donation page on our website. We also use Patreon account that people can donate to. And then there's also the individual grants that we might apply to for specific projects. So, I would say one of the biggest strengths of Bellingcat has been its independence from donors, and so I think going forward, that's something that we're going to want to continue to be independent from in particular government donors.
And for the other media that you work with or offer your content with or aggregate your content through, do you find that problematic, or would this be more for an investigative site and less of a problem for, I don't know, a culture magazine?
Well, I think that's a decision that every outlet has to make for themselves. I know that when we engage in a partnership with an outside organization, we have conversations with them about things like that, like where are you getting their funding from? We've been really lucky so far in that we've been able to find and work really well with excellent partners all around the world, not just here in Europe. But again, that's a decision that everybody's going to have to make on their own, and it's something that's very place specific, right? I hope that this initiative in Sierra Leone works really well. There are conditions in Sierra Leone that are hyper-specific to Sierra Leone that might make that work better than it might work here, for example, if the Dutch government, started giving a certain percentage of its GDP to media. I'm originally from Venezuela. Again, very specific local conditions there that would make that more or less possible. It's the media landscape is a complicated one, not just nationally here in the Netherlands, but all over the world. And so everybody has to make those decisions on their own as best as they can.
Yeah, I'd like to return to what Babah has said about, sort of the catchphrase of, in a sense, of this conversation, that I own this place. This is a feeling that I only get as a Hungarian in Austria, because it's sort of taken from my grandparents. So, I never had this feeling in Hungary, by the way. But let's get back to Austria and to more relevant experiences about ownership, and specifically about public broadcast or publicly funded media, and how this can be integrated with everyone else, which is very much your passion and something that you have a strong proposal about, Alex.
I absolutely agree that the public service broadcasters, there is no real diversity. So there is no real representation. If you look in Vienna, there are 40% of people living there have a migrant background, and you can see nil almost in the public service media. I don't talk about the other private media sector. So this is actually really a big point, and this is also somehow that I think we're going to have to address on a higher level. Like culture, also media is a national a responsibility or competence in the European Union, and this is something we're going to have to change, because there are some problems that cannot be dealt on a national level. In Austria, for example, the public service media are much too close to the government. It is the situation now that the strongest party, with just 35% of the vote, were able to vote on each and every seat in the public service broadcaster on their own, and this is something that doesn't make sense. And I mean, this is against the Human Rights Convention, and this is also something we're going to have to address on a European level, that if public service media don't work properly, then there has to be some sort of mandate to change this. On the other hand, I think without public funding, nothing would work. We're going to have to face the situation. In the last 10 years, we came to a situation that now 50% of the money that has gone into ads by news services now go to the three biggest big tech platforms. And you can imagine this is something that changes the situation entirely, and the money won't come back to these broadcasters and news platforms anytime again. So without public funding, this won't work. And coming back to this diversity issue, there are small but important initiatives by the Commission to trigger pilots for European platforms. However, I mean, we are talking about 5 million, for example, and nevertheless, this is the structure of the calls are not working for civil society projects. So I'm seeing on the one hand a big opportunity now that there is, after years of talking, something going on, but that it could be without seeing the representation and the diversity that is needed in that, and that we have in Europe. So I see it this way. Either the Commission will be convinced to change their calls, what is apparently quite a hard place or hard work to do, or there are other players like foundations or like the European Cultural Foundation that would step in and take care that this is now not starting again with this big hole of missing diversity and going in the wrong direction entirely. So I think we need this to address the possibility, on the one hand, this representation, but also that people themselves can be involved and not we have this one direction communication. We need an alternative also as some sort of a social medium. And I cannot imagine that public service media will do this job.
Okay, that's a very tall order that we have set up together. I think that can be distilled into a work program, and only like 50 to 70 years of advocacy will bear fruit. Okay, I'm just kidding here. It's going to be much quicker than that. So first of all, I would like to say thank you to the European Cultural Foundation and De Bali for hosting us. And maybe we can leave on this note taken from Babah, instead of "I stole this," which has long been the slogan of European exercise of power, trying to overcome the legacy of empire and in exclusion. It could probably be "I own this," and you can too. This allows for both of us. Thank you so much, and happy Europe Day, everyone. Do follow the program. Stay tuned all day long.